I'm going to tell you a story about my attempts to access and photograph the UK's only prison ship of modern times, Her Majesty's Prison, the Weir. Decommissioned in 2005 and located until recently in Portland Harbour in southwest England, it's now somewhere in Nigeria's troubled oil fields. But the story of this barge is often quite extraordinary. It will take us from Sweden to the Falkland Islands, from Germany to Manhattan. It involves engineers, ship spotters, soldiers, and my brother, Chris. So, where to begin? The first time I saw the vessel was from the back of my brother's house. He used to live on the edge of the seaside town of Weymouth, and from his spare bedroom window you could look out over Portland Harbour, a vast expanse of water, towards the cliffs of the Isle of Portland. At the foot of these cliffs is a private port, and moored in this port was a large, grey, rectangular metal box. Looking from a distance much more like a warehouse than a ship, this was the prison ship, the Weir, with 450 prisoners on board. It had been opened by the Conservative government in 1997. A decade later, though decommissioned, it continued to sit here, in spite of new government announcements that Portland Harbour would be used as the venue for 2012 Olympic Games sailing events. I became fascinated by this extraordinary object, by its form, its notoriety, and its incongruous location. I decided I'd try to photograph it. However, although it was quite clearly visible from a distance, the prison ship proved almost impossible for me to see close up. It was tucked away in heavily restricted waters beneath steep cliffs. So I telephoned Portland Port to try to get permission to photograph the vessel. A port official told me that the Weir was now under new ownership. It had been bought by a company who serviced the international oil industry and was being refitted as a floating accommodation unit for oil workers. They also told me that I would not be permitted to photograph the ship. But, perversely, I became more and more fascinated by the challenge of photographing this most unphotogenic and difficult to access of objects. I started to walk and scramble across the cliffs in search of a decent vantage point. I did discover that the vessel was half visible from a couple of places, very high up. However, the spots where I was standing were immediately outside the entrance to a second, very large prison, ominously called the Verne. Skulking under high prison walls and CCTV cameras, I started to get a bit concerned about my safety and the legality of what I was doing. Luckily, it was then that I remembered that my Barclays bank account offered a free legal advice helpline. So I called them up for some guidance. Barclays lawyers rang me back a few hours later to inform me that although taking photographs of or around a British prison is technically not illegal, I would be well advised to contact the prison authorities to explain my activities and to avoid any misunderstanding. Soon afterwards, in January 2010, I was looking at the website of a local newspaper, the Dorset Echo, and discovered, to my surprise, that the prison ship had disappeared. It had been towed away unannounced and had left UK waters. It was now on its way to Nigeria. The new owners were a company called Sea Trucks Group. I looked at their website and, sure enough, there was an image of the Weir, managing to look almost glamorous. It had gained a new name, Jascon 27, and now had the capacity to house 600 oil workers. Following the vessel's departure, I found myself melancholically searching for news of it, looking at images online. The prison ship's existence had always been controversial in the UK, so there was quite a lot of coverage of its checkered history on the websites of different news organisations. Amusingly, when I looked on Google Earth, I could see it moored in Portland Harbour, even though I knew that it was now gone. Browsing several other images and stories started to emerge. One photograph of the prison ship moored in Portland had had a large text superimposed across it, Soldados 1982. Clicking on the image led me to a lively blog set up by a group of Argentine veterans of the Falklands War. One of them had picked up on the unlikely fact that this former British ship, now on its way to West Africa, had once spent time in the Falklands, serving as a troop accommodation unit for the British Army just after the end of the war with Argentina. Searching for more details, I joined a Facebook group called Falklands 83, and before I knew it, I was looking at pictures of our vessel, moored to the end of a jetty off a newly constructed road near Port Stanley. Former sappers and Royal Engineers were soon sharing faded snapshots of their tours in the Falklands and their memories of life on board. Evidently, officers' and squaddies' quarters were quite separate. For example, several soldiers I spoke to were completely unaware of the existence of a fully enclosed heated swimming pool on board. In fact, this pool was used by groups of local school children learning to swim, the sea in the Falklands being far too cold. One person who told me she remembers swimming on board at the time is Lisa Watson, who is now editor of the Falkland Islands newspaper Penguin News. In the end, several accommodation barges were chartered by the Ministry of Defence for use in the Falklands, and their presence was commemorated on a postage stamp. Our vessel is the one in the distance. A few months ago I made an appointment to visit Lloyd's Shipping Register in London and consulted several volumes of a Scandinavian publication called Det Norska Veritas. I discovered that the vessel had been built in 1979 in a struggling shipyard in Stockholm called Finnboda Row. Launched at a time of global recession, within 3 years this barge, also referred to in documents as a pontoon, had had 3 different owners and had been renamed 3 times. By 1982, its owners were a company called Consafe. The only evidence I could find of the existence of this company was this image of a plate sold not long ago on eBay. Consafe built the vessel into the kind of structure it is today by welding together a lot of shipping containers. With no engine, a flat-bottomed hull, and no bow or stern, this type of non-propelled vessel is known as a coastel, or a flotel. Because it can't move and sits shallow in the water, the best way of shifting it any distance is to piggyback it on top of another boat. That is what we see here in the earliest photograph of the vessel that I've found. Our barge has been floated onto the middle section of a red semi-submersible ship, or heavy lift vessel, for its very long journey from Sweden to the Falkland Islands. On arrival anywhere, though, because it's got its own electricity, water and sewage systems, its reliance on onshore services is minimal. According to Swedish shipping engineer Peter Schörling, who helped to construct the vessel in Stockholm, when Margaret Thatcher's government wanted to charter barges for the Falklands, they were very keen to be seen to be sending only British ships. So a deal was done, whereby a 50% share of our vessel was bought by a Liverpool-based shipping company called Bibby Line, and the ship was reflagged to the UK. I also learnt from Peter that, during its time in the Falklands, our vessel was presided over and looked after by one man, a barge master called Mr. Connell. As we will see, Mr. Connell would in fact go on to live on board our barge for quite a few years to come. After 4 years in the Falklands, the vessel's next few months were spent on the Dutch-German border, housing immigrant workers who were busy building the Passat motorcar in a Volkswagen factory in Endam. But then a new job came in. The mayor of the city of New York, Mr. Ed Koch, had gotten himself a jail crisis. He wanted a solution to ease prison overcrowding. So, after another refit, our vessel was now headed west, for its first stint as a prison hulk. A young steward, Grant Saunders, who had joined the crew in Europe, was waiting for her to arrive on the banks of New York's East River in 1989 and caught this snapshot of her as she was tugged under Manhattan Bridge. Just as would be the case several years later on arrival in Portland, this prison ship's appearance in New York was mired in controversy and legal dispute. East Village community groups and the head teacher of a local primary school, whose view of the Hudson River was now dominated by an unsightly grey box topped by a caged exercise yard, were outraged. Nevertheless, the Bibi Resolution, as the vessel was now called, stayed in position as a prison ship in New York for 3 years, until it was closed and moved under a legal intervention by the city's own river authorities. For much of her time in New York, she served as a drug rehabilitation unit, in which an estimated 85% of inmates may have been HIV positive. This dramatic picture of the vessel, moored alongside in New York, was taken by documentary photographer Jeff Jacobson, who worked for the famous photo agency Magnum. Another black and white photograph showing the Manhattan skyline appears to show our vessel in the foreground, moored to a pier. However, this is in fact a different vessel, a sister ship called Bibi Venture, which was also used as a prison in New York at this time. During this period, our Swedish engineer, Peter Schörling, visited New York to do a technical inspection of our prison ship. He met up once again with his friend, the barge master, Mr. Connell, who had been on board throughout its time in the Falklands and in Germany and was still on board in New York. Peter remembered that the most notable thing about Mr. Connell was his absolute obsession with the musical The Phantom of the Opera. Andrew Lloyd Webber's tunes had echoed through the corridors of our ship for years. So Peter bought them both tickets to see Phantom together in New York. Mr. Connell was absolutely delighted, of course, but did sing very loudly all the way through the performance. A few days after reading about the prison ship's departure from Portland Harbour in January 2010, an odd thing happened. Suddenly, when I did an online search for the vessel, dozens of images of it appeared on all kinds of websites: Flickr, shipspotting.com, shippassion.com, even uglyships.com. Here was our familiar grey metal box, the barred windows, but all in much more detail than I had ever seen before. And this did not look like Africa. In any case, not enough time had passed for it to have reached Nigeria yet. A quick read clarified what had happened. Just 4 days after leaving Portland, the vessel, perhaps unwisely being towed all the way by a tugboat, had run into storms in the Bay of Biscay and had been sheltered in the Spanish port city of La Coruña. Here, moored in the city centre, our former prison ship, now Jascon 27, was suddenly very visible, and became something of a minor celebrity, attracting the attention and amazement of local shipping enthusiasts, city residents, and local journalists alike. Online chat featured a mixture of historical data, bemusement, and hilarity. Then, after 4 days in the spotlight, the vessel was, again, gone. One of the more intriguing images of the vessel I found online early on was a small blurry photograph of a painting of the prison ship, the Weir, moored in Portland Harbour. Clicking on it took me to the website of the artist Trevor John de Pattenden, a British-born wildlife painter based in Dubai. Most of Trevor's other pictures are of birds of prey, butterflies and big cats. They tend to be destined for hotel lobbies, charity auctions, and the residences of Middle Eastern royal families. But a caption accompanying our image explained that this painting had been commissioned from him by the UK Prison Service to celebrate the opening of the floating jail in Portland in 1997. The caption also explained that following the closure of the weir, the painting now hangs in the Prison Service Museum at the Prison Service College, a staff training facility near Rugby. Intrigued, I decided to try to make arrangements to see the picture. However, when I contacted the Prison Service College, they told me that the Prison Service Museum collection had recently been sold off to a tourist attraction in Nottingham called the Galleries of Justice. I was advised to contact the curator there, Bev Baker. But Bev informed me that the painting had never arrived in Nottingham. She reckoned if I emailed the staff training college again, someone might discover it hanging on an office wall. A bit perplexed, I thought I'd contact the artist to get his opinion. A friendly email from Trevor explained that he'd been offered the commission by his father-in-law, who happened to be the first governor of the prison ship in Portland. In fact, the governor had been so delighted by the painting that he had written his son-in-law a letter at the time, praising its remarkable qualities. Trevor also forwarded me a copy of a printed label that the governor had attached to the back of the painting at the time of its delivery. The text confidently stated where the painting would hang in the future, either on the walls of the weir or at Newbold Revel. But Trevor also told me that he suspected that his father-in-law may have been given the painting by the prison service as a retirement gift a few years before. Since the picture could still not be found, I asked him whether it would be possible to contact his father-in-law to find out whether this was true. Trevor explained that sadly this would not be possible because he and his wife had split up a few years ago and he'd now lost touch with his father-in-law, who, in any case, may have moved to America. In October 2011, I submitted a Freedom of Information request to the Ministry of Justice, asking for clarity about the whereabouts of this painting. The reply I received seemed to confirm that this work of art had evaded the custody of its commissioners. I wrote to the Minister for Justice, Kenneth Clarke, to let him know. Several months later, I made a return visit to the Verne, the large prison in Portland, this time with an appointment to meet staff there to discuss working together on an art project, a cliff-top performance to be called The Vessel. We met in the visitors' waiting room. Just as I was shaking hands with one of the prison governors, I noticed, hanging on the wall just behind him, was the painting. Evidently, when the prison ship had been closed, someone had simply brought the picture up the cliff and hung it on the wall. And here it had been, surrounded by notices and prison regulations ever since.